Okay, we're all aboard.
Yeah, it's like NASA here. 10. There we go. Yeah, over to you. All good.
Okay, then. Anyway, good evening, everyone. We're in Medway, Pastor Steve's house, and um, no flowers today. It's not the talk in the morning, so it's a talk in the evening. Anyway, so we'll continue on. I'm just going to go through now. You're not going to believe this is. Oh, yep. Here we go. I can do it manually. Good. All right. So, what I'm going to do tonight, this is actually a simple Bible study from the New Testament, and it's about speaking in tongues. Does the Bible say that we should or shouldn't all speak in tongues at once? And we're going to have a bit of a look at the concept of singing in the Spirit as according to how the Bible defines those words as opposed to how they might appear on the surface. So we'll go through that, which will be very good. Now, just go to the next slide. This is slightly disjointed tonight because I've got other notes that I've had to pull out of it because it's a lot longer talk than what we've got tonight. So the presentation we're going to do now will reveal the following to be true. Chapters 14 of 1 Corinthians only relates to using the voice gifts in the Spirit, and it's not about the time of prayer. And the church, accordingly, the church was not forbidding people to all pray in tongues at once in the sense of the prayer line. So we'll just go through that. We know decency and order. I'm not going to qualify the obvious because that's not what it's about tonight. And the church was not encouraged to sing in the Spirit, which we'll cover in very simple terms. First thing I want to do is actually show you there's a very simple way of learning how to interpret 1 Corinthians 14. So we'll go to the key first of all. When you see it, it's obvious, but it's not obvious unless it sort of gets shown to you. So we'll just go to that. I'm just going to move something around on my screen. I'm right now. And this is how the verses are linked together. Now, I'm not going to read this. I'm just bringing this up to show you something. Now, you'll see that as I bring these verses up, you won't be able to read them clearly, but you see the first word or first couple of words of each verse, like verse 6 says now, and verse 7 links it with and even these things. Verse 8, the first verse says for, which is a conclusion. Verse 9, so likewise, there's a conclusion. Verse 10, there are, which is a conclusion, and carry on from verse 9. Verse 11 says, therefore, concluding the previous. Verse 12 goes, even so. So you suddenly get an idea that you can link all these verses together because the first word of nearly every verse going through this chapter links it and locks it into one topic. In other words, it sets context. Now, that should be pretty obvious as we see this. And I do have notes on this. If you want a copy, I can email them to you just in that form. So what we're seeing now is that as we read through all these verses, which we're not going to do particularly now, there are the verse starting, the first letter starting each verse, link it immediately to the previous verse or the content of the verses which are already spoken. So that's the first great understanding you'll get if you want to put this chapter together in a way which actually fits with how the Bible describes it. Now we'll just go on a little bit. Verse 13 is also a conclusion to verse 12. Verse 14 says for, a conclusion to verse 13. Verse 15 questions everything that's been already written. What is it then? Conclusion of verses 12 through to 14. Verse 16, it's a conclusion of verse 15 where it says else. It's just logically going through a process of verses, asking, copying, imitating, and concluding. Then verse 17 starts with the word for thou verily givest thanks well. So I hope I don't have to do any more. I think we can all get the drift that if you printed the Bible out, this chapter, and coloured the first word, you would see very clearly that you can actually do linking with your pen, just do links and link them all through, and you find that in the end, there's very little of the verse which can't be linked continuously through the whole of the verse, getting particularly down to the end. With that out the way, I'll just go into some very simple things which we've got here we can look at. Now, part 2 is, does the Bible say not to all speak in tongues at once? Well, the answer is it's not talking about speaking in tongues in the sense of praying, but it's in the sense of the gifts of the Spirit, which is a completely different topic. So let's have a look at this as we move through it. I'm just a little bit slow here. I've got a couple of little glitches happening on my screen, but I should be able to get through them. Obviously, they've not been in England before. So I'm just trying to move. All your pictures are sitting over my control panel now. For some reason, here we go. I've got them moved and I think I'm in business. Good, next slide. So the simple answer is no. And we're just going to go through a couple of verses. We'll do this slowly and we'll do it methodically. And we'll just have a look how to better understand a lot of these things. 1 Corinthians 14:23 says here, if therefore the whole church be come together into one place and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that you are mad? This is sort of the verses that lead us into our confusion, which used to be in the past anyway. Verse 24 says, but if all prophesy and there come in one that is believeth not, or one that is unlearned, he is convinced of all, he is judged of all. So these are the verses that we normally have and we work with. And I'd like to show you in a moment, there's a comparison between the verses, which actually makes it very clear how to define what the words are saying. But we've also got, as we looked earlier, we now have the knowledge of the first words of each verse, giving us an indication of the context of following the flow of how the writing went, which is very helpful. What do these verses mean if the words all at once are not used? And we'll see why we ask that question. The solution is found just simply by going back to the start of the chapter. And we're just going to read part of this chapter because it sets the context for what comes afterwards, and all the verses then link. He says, follow after charity, which simply is God's love, and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that you may prophesy. Next verse, for he that speaketh an unknown tongue speaketh not unto men, but unto God. For no man understandeth him, howbeit, or nevertheless in the spirit, he does speak mysteries. But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification, means that they're building up, to exhortation, which is simply consolation, instruction, and comfort, which is to be calmed or to be put in a positive frame of mind. He that speaketh an unknown tongue edifieth or builds up himself, but he that prophesieth edifieth the church. Verse 5, he's very clearly, he wanted the church to follow after God's pattern of love, which is godly service. So this is about serving. It's not about anything else. It's simply about serving, but he's dealing with service in the context of the voice gifts. He goes through now and rationalizes with the Corinthian church that speaking in tongues was good for the person who spoke, but no one else got blessing from it because obviously we'll see they don't understand a word. But he does go on to say that the person who speaks in prophecy actually edifies everyone else, and that is good. So he's just building his case as we go through these verses. We'll go back in 1 Corinthians 14:23. We sort of set the scene that he's already compared the two. We know we're on the gifts because we're following conclusion after conclusion, and we're obviously getting into the gifts, not the prayer line. And the prayer line's got to be considered to be totally irrelevant to what we're looking at because it doesn't fit, it doesn't work, and it can never be brought into context with that. So he says here in verse 23, again, as we cover this point, if therefore the whole church be come together in one place and all speak with tongues, and there comes in those unlearned. Now, we've read this before, but we're reading it again for a purpose. Will they not say that you are mad? Why would they say you're mad? It's not that they all spoke in tongues at once. The answer is that they all spoke in tongues only, meaning that at the time of the gifts, people were speaking out in tongues. And because we have meetings, we know what it's like. We hear the gifts. Can you imagine a meeting where someone used a tongue, then we waited a second or two, then someone else used a tongue, Then we waited a second or two, then someone else used the tongue being the third gift. What benefit would that be to the church? And for the person who comes in off the street, they would look at that and think, well, this is crazy. There's just what possible benefit is there to the fellowship itself with people using only the gifts of tongues without any interpretation or, for that matter, prophecy? And this is why he says in verse 24, but if all prophesy. Now, let's consider verse 23 and 24. We've got them both up on the screen, and both have exactly the same Greek foundation to and all speak with tongues. If all prophesy, it's the same foundation. If it meant all speaking in tongues at once, all right, that means that verse 24 would have to be if everyone prophesied at once. It would have to be equally the same understanding, because the words have the same meaning. It's just all, but it doesn't say all at once. If you read it slowly, it says in verse 23, and if all would speak with tongues, not all at once, but rather if all you did was speak in tongues. And if you go to verse 24, because you've got to make verse 24 work with verse 23, because it's the same debate, same question, same principle. And he says, but if all prophesy, meaning if all you do is prophesy, rather than just have a tongue with nothing and a tongue with nothing, if all you did was prophesy, just had a prophecy, a gap and a prophecy and a gap, then those who come in or unbelievers, they'll be convicted because they understand the words being said, because they're not a tongue which has not been interpreted. Is that clear? I'm just trying to make this as clear as I can. The difference between the two verses is it's not ever, the argument's never been all at once. The words at once aren't there. It just says all, if all speak in tongues, and the other one in verse 24, if all you do is prophesy. So that is the correct way of understanding those verses, and it can never be translated to all at once. If it was, I'll tell you why it doesn't work. If it meant all at once, verse 24 then would give the church permission for everyone to prophesy together at the same time. And there's no way the unbeliever could ever learn from that, and there's no way they could ever get understanding from it. So very clearly, the process of just logic and wisdom and default show us that there's only one answer that works with both those verses. And I believe we do that. We already do it by practice, and we know it. And I think we've sort of moved past the concept that it's talking about the prayer line, because we're clearly in the gifts in the context of these verses. If all prophesied at once, that would equally be as mad, wouldn't it? If you're going to consider that the madness. So we'll just move on a little bit. Just to summarize this, so verse 23 and 24 mean, in their proper context, if they're understood. We have just moved to the next little bit here. The answer is very simple, as I said before. These words are hard to explain in one sentence, but in logic, they're easy to put forward. I'm hoping I'm not confusing you, because it's either got one of two meanings. It's either all at once or all you do. It can't be both. And I think we've got the message very clear that if all we did was speak in tongues and there was no message, of course it would be mad. And we're going to see why with some verses later. But if all we did was prophesy, the people would be edified by what they heard. And we know how it works in the gifts, because we hear the interpretation or the prophecy and it works. If all you do is speak in tongues, it's not about all at once. It's making that point again. If all you do is prophesy, it's not all about all at once. It's simply if that's all you did. The reference to madness, if we go back to verse 16, we just pick up another point here. Verse 16 says else, and keep in mind, else is a continuation. It's a starting word, but it continues to what's said before it, because else is a conclusion. Else, when thou shalt bless with the Spirit, we have a new terminology now that we aren't accustomed to, yet it's very clearly part of the scripture. Using tongues is considered to be blessing people with the Spirit. It's a blessing of God. It's a gift. All gifts are a blessing. So we're getting a slightly different phrasing brought in, but it's equally valid. And some of the other phrasing here is equally as valid, because we clearly, once you understand the context of how it's going to work, you can understand why God's saying this. So when you're blessed with the Spirit means if you use the gift of tongues, how shall he that occupieth the room of the unlearned say amen at thy giving of thanks? saying he doesn't understand what you're saying. Now, there is a view that this verse means that if you gave thanks in tongues, but we're not about giving thanks. It's not about opening and closing prayers. The word else links it to the context already. And so some of you are probably very clearly aware that it's not talking like that. But for the sake of the argument, this is where the first words come in and continually link the context of the chapter together so we know the topic that we're dealing with. So else, when thou shalt bless with the Spirit, which is referring to what he's already covered and what he goes on to cover, which is using the gift of tongues. If there's a stranger there and all they hear you do is speak in tongues, what are they going to understand from that? There's no benefit, and that's the point sort of being made here, that there's no benefit made from what these people are doing at this particular time. Now, you won't believe this, your little photos have all moved again. Here we go. For verse 17, 4 is a conclusion. For thou verily givest thanks well, but the other is not edified. So we have this phrasing continuing. So what we're actually getting is a range of phrases which are giving us God's view of just a clear way of saying what we're actually doing when we're using the gifts of the Spirit. It's a form of giving thanks, which in other words, God has added to the awareness of the blessing by telling us it is a form of giving thanks. If you use tongues as a gift, as opposed to the line of prayer, and the line of prayer, we already know that praying in the Spirit's a very powerful tool, so that's not a question. But when we move into the time of gifts, he's saying, well, you've given thanks well, but verse 17, but the other's not edified. And the time of the gifts are for people to be edified. In verse 11, just to cut back to that verse, because it explains again in these simple words we're talking about, he says, therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice, meaning if all I hear is tongues without any interpretation, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me, meaning we are people of two different languages or cultures that don't understand each other. And if there's no understanding, there's obviously no benefit. So this comparison now, dropping back to why he moved into this topic, helps us understand the point just a little bit further. So the concept of mad is, I'll just have to duck back because it's gone off the screen again, sorry. All these little glitches. It's mad if all you do is use the gift of tongues without the interpretation. So this is the concept of madness, not the fact that there's a big jumble of sound which no one can comprehend. And I think that's important to know that point. Now, we sort of covered these points reasonably well, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. The concept of singing in the Spirit, what does the word sing mean? And now that we know the verses lead in context to a variety of different blessings that the Lord sort of laid out, the voice gifts, we'll now move in and understand this one just a little bit more. So we see in verse 15, what is it then? What is it then? It's a conclusion, concluding what he's already written just before. He said, I will pray with the Spirit and I will pray with the understanding also. Now, a lot of people make an error of assuming that this is talking about now when you're home. This is, or maybe at the prayer room or something. Because of the phrasing, you sort of misconstrue what's being said here. He's saying, what is it then as a conclusion to what he's already talked about? It's not about the prayer room. It's not about your time at home. He's still in reference and in topic and in context with the voice gifts of the Spirit. So his question in verse 15, which he asks a summary answer from, what is it? I will pray with the Spirit. I will pray with the understanding. And we'll just define this in a moment as we move forward. I will sing with the Spirit and I will sing with the understanding. Now, for a lot of people, this might sound like that you can sing in tongues. This is not what's being said here, which I'll prove in a moment, but let's consider this for a moment. I believe that if we wanted to, we could all sing our tongue out of our mouth. But for that matter, if we wanted to, we could yell it out, we could scream it out, we could whisper it out. We could speak it slowly. We could speak it quickly. We could be soft. We could be fast. We can. You can do anything with your tongue. You go in the bank with a balaclava and a gun and rob a bank while you're speaking in tongues. You can do anything, but this isn't the point, which is being made here. Why? Because it's in context. Verse 15. What is it then? Now, you're probably already aware that he's still in context. So somehow the word sing with the Spirit and sing with the understanding has to be linked with tongues and the interpretation, because he's never moved away from that concept as he moves through. So let's have a look how we can link it up. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only answer in the Bible. All I'm saying is that when you understand the first letters and you understand the context and you lock the context in, it's very hard to find any other interpretation rather than what we're going to sort of explain here, because it's in context. Any other interpretation moves it away from that first letter link and it becomes awkward. So let's have a look at the context. Even so, what's even so? That's a continuation of the context. Even so, ye, for as much as you are zealous of spiritual gifts, here's the context: spiritual gifts, not prayer at home, not opening or closing prayer, spiritual gifts. Seek that you may excel, which means to abound, to the edifying of the church. So the whole purpose of the gifts is that the church might be edified. But clearly, if the only gift working is tongues and there's no interpretation, then who's edified? Well, we know the speaker is, because he's already told us that. But the rest of the congregation gets no benefit. So how do we get edification? Well, he goes on to explain it. Now, notice verse 13. Wherefore, conclusion to verse 12. Let him that speaketh in an unknown tongue pray that he may interpret, which simply means to unfold the meaning, what has been said, or to explain or expound what reason, so the church can be edified. So let's pick this up again, because it is clear when you just go slow. Even so, for as much as you are zealous of the spiritual gifts, seek that you may, for the edification of the church, let the one who speaks in tongues, let him seek to interpret. What for? So that the church might receive complete edification. Verse 14 says, for, which is a conclusion to verse 13, and this is an important part we're going to digest now. If I pray, meaning I make prayer. Prayer is any form of communication with God. So keep in mind, when you're using tongues as a gift, not as a language of prayer, but when you're using tongue as a gift, it's still a language of prayer. But this language of prayer is used to speak forth in the meeting to set as a sign to the unbeliever and an indication that you're filled with the Holy Spirit and that God is in you. And it does have benefit to the speaker, but no one else has any benefit from it. Now, in an unknown tongue, he's saying here, if I pray in an unknown tongue, my spirit prayeth, but my understanding, meaning my mind, is without fruit, or it's unfruitful. The spirit is edified, verse 4, which we looked earlier, but the mind isn't. So there is no mental edification, exaltation, or comfort, which is also mentioned in verse 3, if all the church does is uses tongues, because they didn't understand that tongues should be interpreted, nor did they understand that prophecy was there to achieve a very similar result. So this is why he's speaking it to the church clearly and slowly so that they can comprehend what's being said. So in context now, what is it then? What is it then? We've got these words that start again, qualifying what's been said. What is it then? Conclusion to verses 12 to 14 establishes very clearly that the use of the gifts has been about edifying the church and being clear at the same time. He says here, I will pray with the Spirit, which is tongues, and I will pray with the understanding or the interpretation also. Then he says, I will sing in the Spirit. And in the very next verse, which is part of the same conclusion, he says, and I will sing with the understanding also. So now it sounds like, if we don't further undo the language used here and get some learning from it, it sounds like perhaps that you could sing your gift out in the Spirit, but it talks about singing in understanding, which means that you'd have to sing the interpretation. And of course, that all becomes quite ridiculous when you start looking at it with your mind in a little bit clearer space. So That is not what's being said. And not only is it not what's being said, we know from our experience that it doesn't happen that way. It's obvious. We've all of us here today know how the gifts work, and we know how that they work very well. So let's go to the Greek language, because I believe this helps us tremendously in this little word, the word sing. Yes, the Greek does help us, and it's easy because you can look it up yourself. The word psallo, which is translated sing, which is the same word used twice there, it's got several little applications, but many of them aren't singing. What I want to point out to you here, that in a couple of these points here, it means to or to means to cause to vibrate by touching or to twang. To touch or strike the chord, to twang the strings of a musical instrument so that they gently vibrate. He also goes on to, if you're playing the harp, and it also means to sing to the music of the harp. And I'm giving it a whole lot here so you can see I'm not just selectively picking out one that suits me. This is what this word means. And quite often you need to know the context so you can apply the word correctly. Now, we've spent a few minutes now looking at the context, and we see that the context is linked completely, every verse after another, with the concept of speaking the gifts, the tongue, and speaking the gift also in the understanding. It's not about playing music or singing musically, but the reference is a metaphor. And we're going to see how the metaphor of the harp actually fits in perfectly, because it's already mentioned in the verses before we get to where we are, verse 7. Now, remember, in these early verses, he's setting the scene. We haven't got to the point about singing. We haven't got to the point about the tongue. We haven't got to the point about the interpretation. But in the lead in to this explanation in verse 7, he says, and even things without life-giving sound, whether pipe or harp, except they give a distinction in the sound, how shall be known what is piped or harped? And that is the point he actually makes about speaking in tongues. Unless there is a distinction, meaning that everyone can get what is plucked or played or brought forward, what benefit, as he says here, who knows what's being just piped or harped? And that's why he goes on and expresses why we should interpret. And he goes a little bit further here, just 8, keeping the context there for you. He says, for, which is a conclusion, for if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself for battle? He's now metaphoring about clarity of sound. But now he draws a parallel and says, so likewise, parallel, except ye utter by the tongue words easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? For you shall be speaking to the air, meaning no one knows what you're saying, no one understands, etc., etc., etc. So isn't this interesting? He's answered the question himself, because you might remember the word psallo also means a distinct plucking sound. And here he is saying, unless there's actually a distinct sound, something you can separate in your mind and know what's being said, then what value is it? And it's the same with the tongue. If we sit there and all we hear is a tongue spoken, there's no explanation, there's no distinction of what's being said, and we're without knowledge of the next step or the next direction the Lord's giving us, or for that matter, words of blessing. And these help tremendously just to unfold what we're looking at. But I'll admit now, it'll take you 1 or 2 times to read through it slowly, colour in the leading words, and just go back over it and you'll see how it works. He says in verse 10, there are, it may be, so many kinds of voices in the world, and none of them was without significance. Okay, so he's also acknowledging sound. Then in verse 11, he now concludes again, therefore, going back to the original debate, which we've been looking at, which he brought up, if I know not the meaning of the voice, meaning if all we do is speak in the church and all we have is the gift of tongues, but nothing else, he says, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, which we've just looked at a little bit earlier, but now we're in further context. And that's simply one who doesn't grasp the culture that's happening within the church fellowship. And he that speaketh shall be unto me someone who I don't know about, simply a barbarian again. So that point is mentioned, and I bring us back to this because it just helps satisfy the concept of learning what these things mean. So let's apply the correct usage, and this is what is summary. What is it then? keep in mind, first words, they're a conclusion to verses 12 and 14. I will pray with the Spirit, which we know is tongues, and I will pray with the understanding, interpretation also. And now we move in perhaps to the very important part that we wanted to cover on this topic. And again, all your pretty little faces have moved over my control panel. I'm just moving it back again. Here we go. So I'm sorry we had that break because it alters the flow of what I'm trying to bring forward to you. I'll just start verse 15 again. What is it then? This is a conclusion. I will pray with the Spirit. I'll pray with the understanding. Then he says, I will sing with the Spirit. And let's translate that as we see. It can be translated equally and clearly with the Greek. The word sing simply means equally to pluck the strings of a musical instrument. In other words, I will just be distinct in my sound. So if we're going to use tongues, let's be distinct with the sound so that it brings forward a purpose and a meaning. And that way, when you bring out the tongue, then you bring out the understanding. So it's tongues, interpretation, which is simply the further extension of this concept of plucking the instrument, which we already read earlier. And he said, and I will sing with the understanding. So what he's done, he's repeated the verse before, but this time he's added the word sing, which is a horrible English word to try and make this work. And what he's really saying simply is, I will make a distinct sound. This is his conclusion. I will be distinct. We'll have one tongues, and I'll be distinct, and we'll have the understanding or the interpretation. Then we'll do it 3 times, which he covers a little later on. Now, these verses are covered in verses 7 and 9. And like I said, there might be other ways you can read these and say what you like, but in context, it doesn't work. So when you have a look in your Bible and you're thinking about this and pondering on this point, should you need to, the word sing simply is wrong in English. It really is not the right word. The word is simply sallo, which is equally and most often used to pluck or make a distinct noise. And he's already covered that in the earlier verses like the trumpet and the harp, etc. He's already made this point, and we see very clearly the context. What is it then? Verse 15 is a lead into what he's already covered. So we just looked at those points, and I find them very helpful. And just to sort of summarize these points to a degree, unless the sound heard is significant, who knows what it means? Like the voice gifts need to be distinct, the same as our talk. We don't sit there and say, God loves you, therefore you say. We actually distinct. We define what we say down to another level. We talk about repentance and baptism, the Holy Spirit. We talk about evidence and signs. And here we are now where Paul's actually into evidence and signs. And because they hadn't used nor perhaps understood quickly how the gifts would be working, he's had to point out to them that this tongues on their own doesn't work all that well in the gifts. Certainly excellent in prayer, but it's not good at the time of the gifts because people can't take direction from it. They can't get edification. They can't get blessing outside of the individual who's actually speaking in tongues. So this statement is made in the middle of an explanation about the use of the voice gifts in a church meeting. Why is it used there? Because God didn't mean it to be confusing. It's just the translators, as they do from time to time, get words which are a little bit difficult. They don't understand speaking in tongues. They don't understand the operation of the gifts. As even many of our spirit-filled brothers and sisters around the world and other denominations, they don't understand what you know. They don't even understand salvation, many of them, let alone to move to another level and get these verses to make them work at the time of the gifts. Verse 16, else. I hope you like the concept that there's a conclusion, else, starting word, concludes to verse 15. When thou shalt bless, which we read a little bit before, when we shall bless with the Spirit, which is a gift of tongues, how shall he that occupieth the room of the unlearned say amen at thy giving of thanks, seeing he understandeth not what is being said? So when we start tying these gifts together, we keep coming back to the one obvious conclusion. We can sort of reverse engineer this, and I don't say this as a cop-out or a way of avoiding Bible accountability, but we can reverse engineer all this because we know how the gifts work. We have them operating in our church. We look back at them and we can say, Well, that's not how it works, because we see from experience how it works. And the combination of having the experience of how it works and the combination of understanding this first word lead in each verse, you can generate context. And then having some of these Greek words explained, we end up exactly where we were before we started this talk, but now we can perhaps better explain how these verses are used and how we might interpret them. It doesn't change anything we believe. It doesn't change anything we do, but it might mean there's one or two verses you may have used for other reasons that really aren't valid in the context you're using them. There are plenty of verses that are talking about using language of prayer. There's plenty of verses about praying in the Spirit. There's plenty of verses about opening and closing meetings in prayer and praying in your closet at home. But these verses aren't the ones to use when you do those type of explanations. These are about the gifts in the church. And when you label them all out and go from verse 1 right down as far as you can, linking all these things, you get 3/4 or 4/5 of the way through the chapter, and you realize it's one topic. And that's very helpful if you're going to do a little bit of a Bible study. So tongues, when used as a gift, must be followed by interpretation. But obviously in the prayer line, if we speak in tongues as we do, and we're able to, of course, we're always encouraged to keep it within a dignified level, and of course not raving and ranting and shaking around or waving arms, which none of us do anyway. We find that we don't have a problem with this. Our problem is with people who try and argue with it. And I'm just hoping that some of these little thoughts shared with you tonight will open it up a little bit better for you. So just concluding, therefore, remember, conclusion, first word, verse 11, we're back before all this started again. If I know not the meaning of the voice, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian. You might remember we covered that point, meaning there's no gain to me if the person at the time of the gifts only speaks in tongues, and that's all we get at the gifts. We really need the interpretation to come with it. So no one knows the meaning. No one knows the meaning. And of course, very clearly, this was never intended to be part of the time of prayer. It was never intended to be part of the time of prayer. So very clearly, if no one understands, it's not about prayer. No one's ever meant to understand you when you're praying in the Spirit in the prayer line. It's never meant to be understood. It's never meant to be any interpretation or flow from that. It's between you and the Lord and the person praying with you. However, in the gifts, the tongue has to have a benefit to the church. And that benefit from the gift and the gift only, as opposed to praying separately and away from the time of the gifts, there's no understanding for that, but there is understanding at the time in the church meeting. And this is the distinction being made. So this chapter does not forbid the church to all pray in tongues at once. What it does forbid is that in the voice gifts, then the tongue needs to be on its own, not collective with everyone else. And it is certainly not about the prayer time. So that's a pretty simple summary. And tongues need to always be followed with interpretation in the time of the gifts. So to sing in the Spirit, as we see earlier, is a false notion. The words don't work, the context doesn't work, and experience shows us it doesn't flow. But look, I'm not being unkind. There may be someone here who said, oh, I sung in the Spirit once and it was wonderful. Well, it might be. You can do a lot of things in the Spirit that are wonderful, but this voice isn't telling you or giving you permission to do that, even though you might do other things in your privacy of your home. This verse is not giving you permission to do that. That's the point I'm trying to make. There's other ways of looking at it. So the gifts need to be distinct, they need to be in order, and they need to be understood. Anyway, so that's a summary of it. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sorry I got mucked up trying to get this thing to move at times. Sometimes you break the concentration. It can make it a little bit difficult to latch your point, but I do have notes on this. You can, if you want, I'll make them available. You can read them slowly, go through them, and just go over them. And I'm happy to answer any question you have, but keep in mind, I don't claim to be the only one in the world who knows what these verses mean. There's probably a lot of different things that people could say, but following context, it's hard to come up with another explanation. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks for being on.
Thank you, Pastor Brad. That was super. He's talking a singing voice.
Okay.
Singing praises.
Okay.
Actually,
The vicar talks with a singy voice.
from Liverpool, it's almost like singing in tongues, isn't it?
Sorry.
Thank you, Pastor Brad. That was super.